Before anyone could change the subject, the atmosphere on set suddenly shifted. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Make sure to subscribe to Table Turn and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. On this particular morning, the atmosphere on The View felt familiar and upbeat. The panel had already moved through the usual hot topics, touching on politics and pop culture with the kind of overlapping commentary the show is known for. When Hugh Jackman walked out to join the table, the energy shifted into something lighter. The audience stood, applauded warmly, and he greeted the hosts with the easy confidence of someone who has spent decades navigating both Broadway and Hollywood interviews. He was there to promote a new film and a charitable initiative he had been speaking about in other appearances. The conversation started comfortably. Whoopi Goldberg welcomed him with her usual steady tone, acknowledging his long career and his ability to balance action roles with musical theater. Joy Behar made a joke about Wolverine needing to break into song more often. Hugh laughed, leaning back in his chair, clearly relaxed. For the first several minutes, everything moved along predictably. Hugh spoke about returning to a physically demanding role and how training has changed for him over the years. He emphasized discipline, teamwork, and gratitude for fans who have supported him. The panel nodded along. Sunny Hostin shifted the conversation slightly, asking about the pressure of maintaining a certain public image. Hugh answered thoughtfully, mentioning that fame can create expectations that aren't always realistic. It was when the discussion turned toward celebrity activism that the tone began to shift. Whoopi, who often takes a measured but firm stance on how public figures use their platforms, asked Hugh about a recent comment he made in another interview regarding entertainers speaking out on political and social issues. In that prior interview, Hugh had suggested that actors should lead with compassion and avoid becoming divisive voices. Whoopi leaned forward slightly and asked him directly what he meant by that. Her tone wasn't hostile, but it was focused. Hugh responded that he believes artists can contribute positively by encouraging unity rather than amplifying conflict. He said that while he respects activism, he personally prefers to engage in charitable efforts behind the scenes rather than making strong public political statements. There was a brief pause. Joy interjected with a light comment about how staying neutral can sometimes be its own political position. The audience responded with a mix of murmurs and a few claps. Hugh smiled politely, but didn't interrupt. Whoopi then pressed a bit further. She said, in her calm but unmistakably firm delivery, that for some communities, speaking out isn't about division, it's about survival. She clarified that historically, entertainers have used their voices to challenge injustice. Her body language changed subtly, her shoulders squared, and she maintained steady eye contact with Hugh. Hugh listened, nodding. He responded that he doesn't disagree with the importance of speaking up when necessary. However, he reiterated that he feels most effective supporting causes quietly and encouraging dialogue instead of confrontation. His voice remained even, but he sat more upright now, signaling that he understood the conversation had deepened. Sunny jumped in to say that silence can sometimes be interpreted as indifference. The audience gave a noticeable reaction, not loud, but enough to shift the room's energy. The once light promotional segment was now clearly something else. Hugh took a breath before answering. He acknowledged that perception matters and that he's mindful of that. He explained that as someone who works internationally, he tries to focus on universal messages of kindness and inclusion. Whoopi responded by saying kindness is important, but so is clarity. She emphasized that clarity about where one stands can provide reassurance to marginalized groups. There was no shouting, no dramatic gestures, but the tension was visible in the pacing. The panel began speaking more deliberately. Hugh paused longer between sentences. Whoopi's tone remained measured but unwavering. The exchange felt less like an argument and more like a philosophical difference unfolding live. Still, the audience could sense the friction. Applause came in shorter bursts, and laughter disappeared entirely. As the segment moved forward, Hugh referenced his charitable foundation and detailed the tangible work it supports. He stressed that his focus has always been on action rather than commentary. Whoopi acknowledged that work, but circled back to the idea that words also matter. At this point, Joy attempted to lighten the mood, joking that perhaps everyone should just sing a duet and call it even. The audience laughed, grateful for the release. Hugh chuckled, but the conversation didn't fully reset. Whoopi gently but clearly stated that entertainers have influence whether they seek it or not. She asked Hugh directly if he felt a responsibility to take clear stances on contentious issues. The question hung in the air. Hugh answered carefully. He said responsibility comes in different forms, and he doesn't believe there is a single correct way to serve. His tone remained respectful, but his words carried a subtle firmness now. You could feel the segment balancing between respectful debate and genuine disagreement. The camera cut between close-ups of both faces, showing attentive expressions rather than smiles. The discussion had clearly moved beyond promotion. It had become a live examination of what it means to be a public figure in a divided climate. And that was only the beginning of how the exchange unfolded. As the segment continued, the tone in the studio remained noticeably more serious than when Hugh first walked out. What had started as a promotional conversation had now turned into a broader discussion about responsibility, visibility, and the weight of celebrity influence. The audience, which had been lively earlier, was now quieter, listening closely. Whoopi picked up right where the previous exchange left off. She clarified that her point wasn't about forcing anyone into political battles, but about recognizing the impact silence can have. She explained that when influential figures avoid clear positions during moments of national tension, some viewers may interpret that as disengagement. Her delivery was calm, but her words were deliberate. She wasn't interrupting, but she also wasn't backing down. Hugh nodded, maintaining steady eye contact. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, a posture that suggested he wanted to be fully engaged rather than defensive. He acknowledged the concern and said he understood how perception works in today's climate. However, he added that he's cautious about oversimplifying complex issues in short interviews or social media posts. Sunny followed up, pointing out that clarity doesn't always require oversimplification. She said that sometimes even a straightforward statement of values can make a difference. There was a light ripple of applause from a portion of the audience, though it wasn't overwhelming. It was the kind of reaction that signals agreement without turning into a spectacle. Hugh responded by saying that he tries to express his values through consistent action. He referenced specific programs he supports that promote education and community development. He emphasized that for him, sustained involvement feels more authentic than reacting publicly in the moment. At this point, the pacing of the conversation slowed. There were longer pauses between exchanges. The hosts weren't talking over each other as much as they sometimes do during hot topics. Instead, each person seemed to be choosing their words carefully. Whoopi leaned back slightly, folded her hands on the table, and said something that subtly shifted the exchange. She pointed out that for many viewers, seeing someone they admire speak plainly about injustice can be empowering in a way that private charity work, while important, isn't always visible enough to inspire collective action. Her tone remained steady, but there was an unmistakable seriousness in her expression. Hugh took a breath before responding. He said he never wants to appear indifferent, and if his previous comment suggested that it wasn't his intention. He explained that his hesitation comes from wanting to avoid contributing to polarization. He said he has seen conversations devolve quickly when public figures take strong stances without room for nuance. Joy interjected, noting that polarization often exists regardless of whether celebrities participate. Her remark drew a few knowing laughs from the audience, though the laughter was brief. The mood was still restrained. Hugh smiled politely, but didn't deflect. Instead, he addressed that point directly. He said he believes tone matters just as much as content, and he tries to model respectful dialogue. He added that he has friends and colleagues across a wide spectrum of beliefs, and he values maintaining those relationships without turning disagreements into public battles. The camera briefly cut to Whoopi, who was listening intently. When she spoke again, her voice was softer but still firm. She said respectful dialogue is important, but there are moments in history when clarity outweighs comfort. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt him. But her phrasing suggested that she felt the issue required more urgency than Hugh was expressing. The audience reaction was mixed this time. Some applause, some silence. It reflected the complexity of the discussion rather than clear consensus. Hugh's expression shifted slightly, not to anger, but to concentration. He adjusted in his seat and responded by saying that urgency can take different forms. He shared a brief anecdote about visiting communities impacted by economic hardship and choosing to listen rather than speak. He said those experiences shaped his belief that leadership can be quiet. Sonny leaned in and asked whether quiet leadership is always visible enough in the media age. It was a direct but fair question. Hugh paused before answering. He acknowledged that visibility matters more than ever, but reiterated that he prefers to ensure his words are informed and constructive. At one point, the conversation edged closer to becoming personal. Whoopi referenced a recent event that had prompted many entertainers to speak out publicly. She asked Hugh whether he had considered addressing it more directly. The room grew still. The mention of a specific real-world event heightened the stakes, even though the tone remained professional. Hugh responded carefully, saying he had spoken privately with organizations involved and was supporting efforts in ways that aligned with his values. He admitted that he chose not to issue a public statement because he didn't feel he could add anything meaningful beyond what had already been said. There was a brief pause after that. It wasn't awkward, but it was noticeable. Live television rarely allows silence to linger, yet here it did for a second or two. Whoopi broke it gently, saying she appreciated the honesty of his answer. She made it clear that disagreement doesn't equate to disrespect. That comment seemed to ease the tension slightly. The audience responded with a short round of applause, not celebratory, but affirming. Still, the exchange hadn't fully resolved. The core difference remained: whether public figures should prioritize visible statements or sustained private action. Hugh maintained that he believes in unity-driven messaging and careful engagement. Whoopi maintained that public clarity can serve as reassurance and solidarity. As the segment approached what should have been its closing minutes, the producers clearly signaled that time was running short. The music hadn't started yet, but the conversation had that compressed energy of a live show preparing to transition. Joy made another attempt to shift the mood, asking Hugh about returning to Broadway and whether he'd ever consider hosting a daytime talk show himself. The audience laughed more comfortably this time. Hugh smiled, grateful for the lighter question, and gave a playful answer about leaving that responsibility to the professionals at the table. But even as the conversation pivoted, the earlier exchange lingered in the air. The body language at the table remained composed but thoughtful. No one appeared angry. No one raised their voice. Yet the seriousness of the discussion had left a clear impression. And as the cameras continued rolling, it became clear that the final moments of the segment would determine whether the exchange felt resolved or whether viewers at home would walk away debating what they had just witnessed. As the conversation moved into what felt like its final stretch, there was a noticeable effort from everyone at the table to bring the energy back to something that resembled a traditional daytime interview. But the earlier exchange had shifted the tone in a way that couldn't simply be reset with a joke or a quick promotional plug. The atmosphere was professional, controlled, but undeniably serious. Hugh adjusted slightly in his chair as Joy wrapped up her lighter question about Broadway. He answered with warmth, talking about how live theater keeps him grounded and connected to audiences in a direct way. For a moment, the studio felt relaxed again. There were genuine laughs when he described the unpredictability of live performances, missed cues, spontaneous audience reactions, and the discipline required to stay present on stage. But Whoopi, in her role as moderator, gently steered the conversation back toward the larger theme that had surfaced earlier. Her tone wasn't confrontational, it was reflective. She said that one of the reasons discussions like this matter is because daytime television reaches millions of people who may not engage in political discourse elsewhere. She emphasized that these conversations aren't about catching someone off guard. They're about understanding perspective. Hugh nodded and said he respected that. He clarified that he hadn't felt ambushed. In fact, he said he appreciated being asked directly rather than having assumptions made about his intentions. That comment seemed to ease some of the remaining tension. The audience responded with light applause, signaling approval of the respectful tone both were maintaining. Sonny then added a point that subtly reignited the seriousness of the exchange. She said that while she understood Hugh's emphasis on unity, she worries that the word unity can sometimes be used to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. Her delivery was calm, but precise. She wasn't accusing him personally, but she was challenging the broader concept. Hugh leaned forward again, hands clasped together on the table. He responded thoughtfully, saying unity doesn't mean ignoring injustice. For him, it means creating space for dialogue that doesn't immediately fracture relationships. He acknowledged that different people interpret the word differently, and perhaps that's where misunderstandings arise. The pacing slowed once more. There was a rhythm to the exchange now: question, pause, response, acknowledgement. No one interrupted. Even Joy, who often adds quick commentary, seemed content to let the discussion breathe. Whoopi then shared a personal reflection. She spoke about her own experience navigating public expectations over decades in the entertainment industry. She explained that there were times when she chose to speak loudly and times when she chose to step back, but those decisions came with consequences either way. Her point was that public figures rarely get the luxury of neutrality in the eyes of viewers. The studio was quiet. The audience wasn't reacting loudly anymore. They were listening. Hugh responded by saying he doesn't believe he's neutral on core values. He listed a few principles he stands by: equality, dignity, access to opportunity. He said that perhaps he hasn't always articulated those principles as explicitly as some would prefer, but they guide his work. Sunny asked, gently, whether articulating them more directly would feel like a compromise of his approach or simply an evolution. It was a subtle but important distinction. Hugh paused longer this time before answering. He admitted that he's still learning how to navigate the modern media environment, where silence and speech both carry amplified consequences. There was something in his tone that suggested introspection rather than defensiveness. He didn't appear irritated. If anything, he seemed aware that the discussion had exposed a gray area he continues to wrestle with. Joy finally interjected with a comment that balanced the table's energy. She said that maybe the real takeaway is that there isn't a single template for responsible celebrity behavior. Her remark drew a modest but noticeable round of applause. It was the first time since the disagreement began that the audience reaction felt broadly unified. Whoopi nodded at that, but she added one final thought. She said that while there may not be a single template, there is always impact. Whether someone chooses quiet action or public advocacy, people are watching and drawing conclusions. Her tone was no longer pressing. It was summarizing. Hugh acknowledged that point directly. He said he accepts that visibility comes with scrutiny. He expressed gratitude for being part of a conversation that challenges him rather than simply promotes a project. That comment shifted the mood further toward resolution. The producers signaled again that time was almost up. You could sense the transition coming, the slight tightening of responses, the glance toward the audience, the subtle repositioning of hands on the table. Whoopi thanked Hugh for being willing to engage honestly. She emphasized that disagreement can exist without hostility. The audience applauded more strongly this time, relieved perhaps that the exchange had remained civil. Hugh smiled and said he valued the discussion. He reiterated his commitment to the causes he supports and added that conversations like this encourage him to reflect more deeply on how he communicates those commitments. There was a visible softening in the room. The tension that had built gradually over the segment didn't disappear entirely, but it transformed into something more reflective than confrontational. As the closing music began to rise faintly in the background, Joy made one last light remark about Hugh coming back to sing for them next time instead of debating philosophy. The audience laughed, this time fully. Hugh played along, promising to bring sheet music. But even as the segment wrapped, it was clear that viewers at home had witnessed more than a standard promotional interview. They had seen a respectful but pointed disagreement about public responsibility unfold in real time. Not explosive, not dramatic, but thoughtful and layered. And while the studio applause carried them into the commercial break, the conversation itself was far from over once the cameras stopped rolling. As the segment came to a close and the show transitioned to commercial, the energy in the studio shifted from intensity to release. The closing music played, the audience applauded steadily, and Hugh stood up to exchange brief handshakes and thanks with the panel. From a viewer's perspective, the moment didn't feel explosive or chaotic. It felt like something more familiar to live television, a real disagreement handled in real time, without raised voices, but with visible conviction on both sides. The immediate applause inside the studio was strong but measured. It wasn't the kind of cheering that follows a purely celebratory appearance. Instead, it felt like appreciation for the conversation itself. Audience members stood, some nodding, others clapping with a more reflective expression. There was no sense of hostility lingering in the room. If anything, the mood suggested relief that the exchange had remained respectful despite clear differences in perspective. As the cameras cut to commercial, viewers at home were left replaying specific lines in their minds. Whoopi's emphasis on clarity over comfort, Sunny's point about visibility, Hugh's insistence that unity and action can coexist. None of it had been theatrical. There were no dramatic walk-offs or sharp personal remarks, but the seriousness of the topic gave the exchange weight. When the episode aired in full later that day and clips began circulating online, reactions developed quickly. Short segments of the discussion appeared across social media platforms, often trimmed to the most pointed moments. Whoopi asking whether public figures have a responsibility to speak clearly, and Hugh explaining why he prefers sustained private engagement over public declarations. In isolation, those clips felt sharper than the full context, which had included nuance and acknowledgement on both sides. Viewers responded in divided but thoughtful ways. Some praised Whoopi Goldberg for pressing the issue, saying that daytime television has a unique role in challenging influential guests. Others defended Hugh Jackman, arguing that not every public figure approaches activism the same way, and that consistency in charitable action can speak volumes even without frequent public statements. What stood out in the broader response was that very few people described the exchange as hostile. Instead, many called it tense but respectful. Media commentators noted that the moment reflected a larger cultural conversation about how celebrities navigate public responsibility in a polarized environment. The clip trended not because of shouting, but because of the visible pause before answers, the careful wording, and the contrast between two thoughtful but differing philosophies. Later that afternoon, entertainment news programs referenced the exchange in their recaps of the show. The framing was consistent, a serious on-air disagreement handled with professionalism. Analysts pointed out that Whoopi maintained her moderator role by asking direct questions without escalating her tone. They also observed that Hugh never appeared dismissive or irritated, even when pressed repeatedly. Behind the scenes, according to sources who later spoke generally about the taping, there was no extended confrontation after the cameras stopped. Hugh reportedly thanked the panel again and expressed appreciation for being given the space to explain his position. The hosts, in turn, continued with the day's taping schedule without incident. It appeared that what viewers saw on air was exactly what occurred, a live exchange that unfolded naturally rather than something fueled by backstage tension. In the days that followed, Hugh addressed the conversation briefly during another interview. He reiterated that he respects different approaches to advocacy and values open dialogue. He did not criticize the show or its hosts. Instead, he acknowledged that discussions like that one are part of being a public figure in the current climate. Whoopi, during a subsequent episode of the show, referenced the moment in passing. She reminded viewers that the purpose of the table is conversation, not agreement. She emphasized that challenging guests respectfully is part of the show's format and has been since its beginning. The remark wasn't offensive, it was clarifying. What made this exchange stand out wasn't volume or spectacle. It was the visible shift in posture, pacing, and tone. At the beginning of the segment, Hugh leaned back comfortably, smiling easily. As the discussion deepened, he leaned forward, hands clasped, speaking more slowly. Whoopi's body language shifted from relaxed hosting to focused moderation, her shoulders squared, her gaze steady. Sunny's questions became more deliberate. Joy's attempts at levity served as pressure valves rather than punchlines. For viewers, it felt authentic. It resembled the kind of conversation many people have at their own dinner tables, measured, occasionally uncomfortable, but rooted in genuine perspective rather than performance. In the broader landscape of daytime television, moments like this remind audiences why live talk shows remain relevant. They allow for unpredictability within a controlled environment. They show how disagreement can surface organically when real topics intersect with celebrity promotion. Ultimately, the segment ended not with resolution, but with acknowledgement. Neither side fully shifted their stance. Instead, both articulated their reasoning clearly enough for viewers to form their own opinions. And that's where the conversation now continues, with the audience. What did you think about Hugh Jackman's exchange with Whoopi Goldberg? Did you see it as a necessary challenge or as a difference in communication styles? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Table Turn for more narration-based talk show stories.